The war between Ukraine and Russia affected the whole world, socioeconomically, militarily, and politically. The Russian invasion of Ukraine officially created outrage in Eastern Europe. As the effect of the spring period began to be felt, the war evolved into a much more critical dimension, especially the Baltic countries. Some countries that think that these aggressive actions of Russia will reflect on them in the future have put into action their emergency measures. NATO took over the situation with the start of the Ukraine war. In addition to arming Ukraine, NATO also took defensive measures in NATO member states neighboring Russia. However, while Sweden and Finland, which are neighbors with Russia, have been following a neutral policy for years with the start of the Ukraine war, both countries applied to become members of NATO. Sweden and Finland have followed a neutrality policy since World War II. Russia's aggressive policies moved these two countries away from neutrality. While it was agreed that NATO's actions should not lead to direct conflict with Russia, the alliance was credibly expected to further deter Russian aggression. For this, NATO needed to increase its capacity in a way that is militarily stronger, more politically cohesive, and stable, and diplomatically more capable. Sweden and Finland are strongholds of core Western values that NATO also champions in the event of a confrontation with Russia. This critical process will not only be shaped by the competition of leaders or armed forces, the fact that these countries, which are known for their neutrality and are economically highly developed, a part of the Ukrainian alliance, will not only support the self-confidence of NATO and allied states, but also open a new political front for Moscow. In addition to the fact that these two countries opened the political front against, Sweden managed to shake the balance again by announcing a new military aid package to the Ukrainian army. Swedish Foreign Minister Ann Linde announced that her country will send 5,000 anti-tank guns, 5,000 helmets, 5,000 body shields, and 135,000 groceries to Ukraine in military aid, as well as 47 million in funds to the Ukrainian army. Today, Sweden has sent 8 more military aid packages too, the largest of which totaled 287 million sent in November, according to Swedish Prime Minister Wolf Kristersson. While details on the military aid packages were limited, Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov stated that the packages included air defense systems, ammunition, and vehicles and personal equipment, especially for the winter. Sweden's new military aid package included air defense systems, spring munitions, and a special aid package to assist the country's spring offensive. In addition, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lydon from the Swedish Defense Academy announced that the Swedish Ministry of Defense has submitted a report that can supply Ukraine with 48 Archer and 12 155mm wheeled, self-propelled howitzers. The decision to send the longest-range self-propelled guns, Archer, to Ukraine by Sweden shook the world's agenda. The effects of the shock aid movement were felt most in Moscow at the moment, especially when Ukraine's eastern front lines are quite complicated. Archer's arrival in Ukraine greatly increased the final gains of the Ukrainian army, both Donetsk and in Luhansk. Sweden's arches, which are used extensively in the back-out front line these days, doubled the pressure on the Russian forces. Because, as we mentioned, the ongoing frontline clashes in Bakhmut and other regions of Donetsk, the use of self-propelled guns with the longest range in the Ukrainian army has changed the course in these regions. On the other hand, the Russians only talk about their gains in SOAR, especially in recent days. But if you noticed, with Archer and other Swedish military ammunition reaching the Ukrainian army, Kiev took control of an important city like Vlada, and Beckman started to concentrate much more on the front. In fact, it is of vital importance to provide this military support to the Ukrainians, who are much more active in the Hands region, featuring a critical game changer. Archer is an 8x8 truck-mounted 155mm self-propelled howitzer, jointly developed and manufactured by Swedish company Bofors and BAE Systems. The original version of the Archer is based on a modified Volvo construction equipment, a 30D articulated dump. But this equipment can also be used on other truck chassis, such as the MAN 8x8 Archer is armed with 155mm 52 caliber gun combined with 21 rounds and an 18-charge automatic loading system. Magazines handle all types of 155mm artillery munitions, including advanced sensor-fused and precision-guided munitions. Depending on customer requirements, the loading magazine can be adapted to conventional bags or modular systems. Fire abilities in Archer include direct fire and multiple projectile simultaneous strikes. In addition, the maximum firing range of this striking gun is 40 kilometers with conventional 155mm and 60 kilometers with precision-guided ammunition, including Excalibur. The Archer's crew cabin is protected against nuclear, biological, and chemical threats, artillery fragmentation, mine attack, and excessive explosive pressure. Significant crew separation from weapons and ammo further increases survivability. These guns are mounted on a commercial articulated vehicle, specially specially developed for high mobility in the toughest terrain. It can operate at a maximum speed of 70 kilometers with a maximum cruising range of 1,000 kilometers. The artillery system is supported by an ordnance supply vehicle designed to allow the howitzer to be fully reloaded in minutes. In addition, Sweden has already supplied Ukraine with a T-4 light anti-tank and Robot 17 anti-ship missiles. The fact that Sweden does not leave Ukraine alone and has a border with Russia puts Sweden in an important position, both in terms of the ongoing war and in suppressing Russian imperialism. On the other hand, the recent debates in NATO's balance between Europe and the Atlantic have created a situation open to regional challenges. The Russian invasion of Ukraine also took place in the midst of these conflicts, which is precisely why NATO failed to provide a quick joint response with the NATO membership of Sweden and Finland. The hope that the European wing will become stronger has prevailed in this way. It was envisaged that the neighboring countries to the Russian threat would lead NATO to play a more active role in the conclusion of the war. When military capacities are evaluated, it is seen that both countries are above NATO standards. Finland has already met NATO's 2% budget. Sweden also plans to do this by 2028. Both countries are increasing their investments in vehicles and ammunition, as can be seen in the examples of the dozens of high-end F-35 fighters that Finland has ordered and Sweden's development of one of the most prominent warplanes. The group and having officially increased the exchange of information with NATO after Russia's war against. These two countries participated in every meeting on war issues and became somewhat involved in the defense capacity of the alliance. When we look at it geographically, it's a scene that these two countries have some advantages against Russia. First, with Finland joining NATO, the alliance's border with Russia will double by an additional 1,340 kilometers. The situation is quite problematic for Moscow because Finland is a neighbor to most strategic region of. In addition to being one of Russia's conventional force centers, this region is also priority in terms of nuclear capacity. It can be thought that one of the main pillars in which Moscow relies on the threat of spreading the war is to build up in this region. However, it is obvious that Ukraine's freedom struggle be supported with the participation of the Baltic countries, Sweden and Finland, which are very difficult to defend for NATO and therefore pose a serious threat to Russia. On the other hand, considering Russia's strategic St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad regions on the Baltic coast, this creates a security dilemma for both sides. We know that Russia opposes the NATO membership of Sweden and Finland. When all the psychological, political, and military issues are evaluated together, it can be predicted that the inclusion of the two countries in NATO in harmony with all the allies will strain Moscow's defense capacity and trigger the possibility of adopting a new strategy. It can be expected that Russia will take a strategic step back and incline to negotiations in the field of Ukraine in order to manage this transformation process, or just to implement new measures against new threats. However, the military and financial support made and planned to be made to the Ukrainian army may reduce the possibility of possible peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Because Ukraine wants to be free in its own country, as in the old days, the Kiev administration demands that Russia completely leave Ukraine and remove all its soldiers from the country's borders. The fact that the Russians do not agree to this and the Ukrainian army is getting stronger day by day increases the possibility of the realization of Kiev's idea of freedom. The next news: unbelievable operation by the Ukrainian army. Russian ships surrounded in the Topol River. The secret naval operation of the Russian army was foiled by the Ukrainian army. The war between Russia and Ukraine has now moved to a different dimension. Russian forces are slowly losing the territories. The Russian army, which started to lose its power in Ukrainian territory as the war dragged on, took action to take back the lost territories. The Russian army, which managed to capture both sides of the Dpa River at the beginning of the war, maintained its presence here for a long time. The capture of the Dpe River posed a great danger for the capital Kyiv. In case the Russian army lands troops over the river, the Russian forces may suddenly enter the border zone. In order to prevent this, the Ukrainian army has carried out a major operation on the Dpo River in recent months. Russian forces who managed to capture this Abraya region also managed to take control of the Dpo River. Russian forces are organizing airstrikes on the Ukrainian-controlled city of Dro with the missile systems they have placed in the Zia region. The Russian army, which organized the attacks on residential areas, and 10 Nero-made Vladimir Zelensky vary. The Ukrainian army took ion to prevent Russian forces from letting troops from the Dpo River towards Kyiv. Russian forces captured the DPO coastal towns of Majorca and Tiva and started to mass troops in this region, Ukraine. Authorities started to think that the Russian army would launch an attack in the near future. Ukraine moved towards the Deva River with an army of 5,000. It blocked the occupying Russian forces in the towns of Majorca and Deva. After hours of fighting, the Russian forces in Deva and Majorca were cleared. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Kashko confirmed with trouble of Russian troops from the Geneva River, stating that they have withdrawn from the Geneva River. For now, Hanko stated that the Russian army will come back. The Chief of Staff of Ukraine stated that after the operation organized by the Ukrainian army, the enemy had no choice but to flee. It is said that more than 150 Russian soldiers were neutralized in this operation, stating that they continued their offensive towards the Zaporizhzhia region. Ukrainian officials stated that all the regions occupied by Russia will soon be under Ukrainian rule. It is said that in the last few weeks the control of 8 occupied regions has passed back to Ukraine. However, the troop landing ships seen on the Dpa River today caused the Kiev government to sound a red outlet. Russian forces, which lost control of the Dpa River, took action to recapture this river. The Russian landing ships mobilized from Kherson entered to Geneva River and advanced toward. Russian soldiers in the Sapir region were put on board the ships and moved towards the city of Daniro. Russian ships, which wanted to land troops in the town of Vaka, a town close to Thuro region where Ukrainian forces are located, continue to move forward. Unaware of everything, Russian ships approached Vaka coast to land However, at this very moment, the Ukrainian army started shelling to Russian ships with artillery shells. Russian commanders did not know that the Ukrainian army had advanced war. Onika, Russian intelligence, did not give this information to Russian commanders. The Ukrainian army started firing at the Russian ships with mortars that had placed into city of Orca. Ukrainian soldiers destroyed the Russian ships in a very different. Ukrainian soldiers targeted the Russian ships with a portable FIM-92 Stinger model onto aircraft missile. When the missile was fired, a huge explosion occurred on the Russian ship. The flames from the explosion reached meters high and the Russian ship began to sink. The Ukrainian army designated a Russian ship, an aircraft missile surrounding the Russian soldiers who managed to reach the shore. Ukrainian soldiers defeated the Russian forces in cross. Russian soldiers who managed to lower the boats on the intact ships into the river started to retreat by jumping into the boats. The Russian army was planning to land troops in the city of Orca and ambush Ukrainian soldiers in the city of Deva, but things did not go as they planned. It is said that more than 250 Russian soldiers lost their lives in this operation, organized by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army, which continues to control the DPO, does not let Russian forces pass here. Russian leader Putin was very angry when the Dnieper River, which was previously under the control of the Russian army, passed to the Ukrainian forces. Putin, who has blown up and neutralized old bridges and railroad bridges on the Dnieper River, is very afraid of the Ukrainian army's advance. Putin is very worried about the increasing losses of the Russian army on Ukrainian, but Russian citizens are not informed about the Russian army's casualties. The Russian government does not disclose the number of soldiers who lost their lives in Ukraine, saying that this is a state secret. The Russian authorities do not want Russian citizens to revolt. According to the statements of the Ukrainian General Staff, the losses of the Russian army in Ukraine have accelerated 150,000 in its last statement made months. The Russian government stated that the losses of the Russian army were less than 10,000. But the Russian people do not believe this data. UNE has been the president of Russia for many years and still is. There is no way that a head of state who has been at the helm of the country for so long would not exhibit dictatorial behavior because citizen Vladimir Putin's behavior after winning the last. The Russian leaders started to control the judiciary and the media. In Russia, we would not be wrong if we say that Putin, who has taken over all arms of the state, rules the whole country alone. Even though Russian citizens are uncomfortable with this situation, they cannot speak out. Even in the first months of the war, tens of thousands of Russian citizens were detained and imprisoned on Vladimir Putin's orders in protest against the Russian army's occupation of Ukraine and put. Russian citizens have started protests in many places, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Putin, who initially thought that this was not a danger, mobilized the Russian security forces. As these protests started across the country, Russian security forces arrested many Russian citizens by force. Putin and banned protests in the country. After these protests, it was also criminalized to make anti-war statements on any television. Opposition officials who oppose this situation are being imprisoned. 1. Russian opposition officials have have addressed Russian citizens in many parts of the country to call the end of the Vladimir Putin's regime. Opposition officials will fight the invasion of the Russian army in Ukraine. Rome asked for support from Russian citizens of every pundit as filing lawsuits to prevent these dis. Putin, who controls the judiciary in the country, has the power to jail anyone who stands in his way. However, these protests are not only taking place within Russia. Many Russians and Ukrainians living abroad came together and organized anti-Putin protests. Protests against Putin were organized in countries such as the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Russian citizens were fed up with Putin's oppressive and aggressive policies are causing the anger of the Russian people against Putin to increase even more. In addition, recently there have been frequent reports that Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine have started to protest. The soldiers fighting in Ukraine, especially the minority citizens, have decided to lay down their arms and want to leave Ukraine. However, Putin has imprisoned Russian soldiers in Ukraine, saying those who run away from the war will be imprisoned.